what Harris has to do to win is to hold those three Rust Belt states that are swing states. So that's Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. If she holds those three and every other state that she held, that Biden won, she can afford to lose Georgia and Arizona in the Sunbelt down south.
Now, while we're in the home straight, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump have set out their final stalls. They're swishing through the battleground states in the last rush before voting day. The last week has been a bit of a series of gaffes from both sides. There was the famous, now in the wrong way, comedian who insulted Puerto Rico at a New York rally yesterday. Joe Biden was in it, rather, for jumping onto all of this. Seemed to call Trump voters garbage. Have a listen.
Donald Trump has no character. He doesn't give a damn about the Latino community. And just the other day, a speaker at his rally called Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage. Well, let me tell you something. I don't know the Puerto Rican that I know, or Puerto Rico where I'm in my home state of Delaware. They're good, decent, honorable people. The only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters. His demonization of Latinos is unconscionable.
Well, that didn't come out maybe quite as well as it might have done. I mean, Joe Biden and his team insist he was calling what it was that this comedian had to say about Puerto Rico and the Latinos. He was saying that was garbage, not Trump supporters. But Donald Trump himself, as you'd expect, he jumped on this thing. He climbed into a bin lorry covered in Trump campaign banners. He talked to journalists, seemed to take those comments, or made a show of taking these comments very seriously.
I think the Democrats have done a very poor job. We're leading in every state. We're leading big, and I think that the comment made by really both of them, because there are really two of them, about being garbage, maybe 250 million people, they shouldn't be talking. That's like deplorable for Hillary. This is the deplorable for Hillary, and I think this is worse, actually. For Joe Biden to make that statement, it's really a disgrace.
Well, let's first of all then touch in with David Charter, Times U.S. Assistant Editor in the United States. Hello to you, David.
Hello, John from Washington, D.C.
Welcome to the show, David, as always. So, Garbagegate, I don't know if anyone's calling it that now, but I just did. And the way that it's played out, what do you make of it? It's a study, David, in election gaffes and election gimmicks, isn't it, all at once?
Yeah, and Trump, the great showman, he leapt upon it immediately. Not only did he show up with a garbage truck in Wisconsin, but he had a rally last night there, and he wore the fluorescent vest that is worn by the garbage collectors throughout the rally, and made great play of it, saying that his staff talked him into it because they told him it made it look thinner. So that's how they convinced him to wear it. And it was really Trump in his element. He'd got something to campaign on, to fight back against, and completely overwhelm any coverage that Kamala Harris might have earned from her big supposed closing speech in Washington, D.C. on the Tuesday night. Well, it's all really been overshadowed by this row about garbage. And I have to say, it's that sort of classic sub-editor's dream headline, an apostrophe catastrophe.
Yes.
Because that's how the White House tried to spin it. They said that the garbage belongs to the supporters. So there's an apostrophe on it. It was belonging to the supporters, yes, rather than describing the supporters without an apostrophe. Yeah. Well, that is pretty lame. It hasn't worked. Even if it was the intention, it hasn't worked. And I'm sure the Harris campaign's tearing his hair out about it, to be honest.
I mean, inevitably, David, people like us are going to focus with laser-like intensity on just about everything that happens in these crucial final days. I guess the question that really you want to address is it going to move the dial? Any of this, either way, from what we've seen? This story's been running for days.
Well, we don't know, because very little has significantly moved the dial, although now, of course, Americans are really paying attention. It's quite easy and quite likely that a lot of Americans have ignored much of the build-up to the election, and a lot of the stuff that we've been analysing up until the final week. But early voting is open. The final deadlines for postal votings are closing soon, and people are going to go to the polls on Tuesday. So it's everywhere now. And if you live in a swing state, it's totally unavoidable. The advertising that you're being bombarded with. So on the Republican side, in those swing states, especially Hispanic voters are being targeted with these garbage ads by the Trump side. The Harris campaign has just cut an advert in Spanish to launch at the Hispanic swing voters with the original comments at this was back at the Trump rally on Saturday in Madison Square Gardens, where the comedian was critical. We'd got a joke out of Puerto Rico, because a lot of Puerto Ricans have settled and are voters in the swing states.
Yeah, I mean, there's a big Latino population in Pennsylvania, which, as I was saying, is absolutely one of the crucial battlegrounds, something the crucial battleground, David. I mean, whoever it is that wins Pennsylvania, it is suggested that could be the thing. That could be the thing that tips it.
I agree with that, John. I definitely agree, because what Harris has to do to win is to hold those 3 Rust Belt states that are swing states. So that's Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. If she holds those 3 and every other state that she held, that Biden won, she can afford to lose Georgia and Arizona in the Sunbelt down south. And because Pennsylvania is the biggest one with 19 votes in the Electoral College that actually decides the election, we've got to keep reminding, of course, that it's not a straight majority vote for the president. It's based on the states and how big they are and how much weight they carry in the Electoral College. So if she wins, if she holds Pennsylvania, that's more votes, 19, than say North Carolina, which is 16. Georgia is 16. So some of these states she can afford to miss. With the way the maths works out, if she holds those 3 northern states. And because Pennsylvania is A, the biggest, and B, will probably take the longest to count because they haven't speeded up their processes that much this time, well, I think we're going to be hanging on for that state to see who's won the election. And I have to tell you, the Trump people on the ground are really confident. They think they've got Pennsylvania. Really?
And look, in as far as it's possible, David, are you persuaded by the arguments whenever you look at what's written and reported, the columns and the Substack pieces you get on both sides, among the Democrats and among the Republicans, what looks like a conviction that the polls may be very, very even, but the subtext, the undercurrents are working their way? Is it your judgment that the Republicans genuinely believe that they are the ones who are pulling ahead, and that may be the case? Do you have your own view on that, or is it simply not possible to call it?
It's actually not possible to call it, John, at the moment. We're seeing every single poll coming out being very close. We've just got a Washington Post poll on Michigan. And this is interesting. They found that the registered voters split for Trump 47 to 45. But the likely voters, in other words, the smaller group who say they're very certain to vote, they split for Harris 47-46. Right. What does that tell you? It's a turnout game. Yeah. This country is split down the middle. If 100% of people voted in this country, it would be 50-50. Yes. It's all about who gets them to the polls to cast their ballot.
Yeah, goodness me, David. I'm looking forward to resuming the conversation when I'm there in the USA next week. David Charter there, US Assistant Editor of The Times. Now, let's get another perspective. Talk to David Lunow, the UK Bureau Chief of the Wall Street Journal. Welcome to you, David.
It's a pleasure to be here, John. Thanks for having me.
Hi. So you're covering obviously you're covering affairs here in England and in UK and in Europe, but you're also looking at the US election through a European and a UK lens. What does that involve? What are the stories you're feeding back to the Wall Street Journal from here with that in mind?
Well, the first story I did was on how insanely costly U.S. elections are compared to the rest of the world. I got the idea when I was looking up after the UK election this summer how much money the different candidates raised. The Tories under Sunak raised about $2.7 million during the 6-week campaign. Labour got about $10 million. Well, Kamala Harris has raised $1.5 billion in the last 2 months. She raises in 5 hours what Sunak raised in 6 weeks. So that got me thinking, oh my, I'm not sure Americans realize just how out of whack our elections are compared to the rest of the world. I mean, the entire UK process took 6 weeks. The winner accepted the result, the loser conceded gracefully, and there was a transition of power the very next day. Here in America, I'm actually in New York right now, our elections take the better part of 2 years. The overall election is going to cost an estimated $15.9 billion. And by the end of this long and exhausting process, I think everyone's just tired of politics. Everyone's been worked up into a frenzy of hate for the other half of the country. And it does make you wonder if this is the best we can do for the world's longest running democracy.
I mean, those numbers, David, are simply mind-boggling. 15, 16 billion dollars. We've just had as you'll know, we just had the budget statement of the Chancellor yesterday in the House of Commons at Westminster. $16 billion. We're talking about the sum, which is not far off what's being devoted in the budget to education across this country. It makes the amounts of money we get in a British election look like chicken feed. It is so extraordinary. Now, meanwhile, there's obviously the perspective on the American election as it is from London, from Brussels, and from this side of the Atlantic. And you'll be reporting, I've no doubt, of the concern on this side of the Atlantic about those implications. It's going to mean so much for America's role as the central pillar of the Western Alliance, to say nothing of the world economy.
Yeah, I tell my friends in America that things look very different when you're sitting in Europe looking back across that vast ocean. Of course, the possibility of Trump winning is the one that really frightens a lot of Europeans. It's really the return of sort of this America first nationalism. It's long been a strain in U.S. politics. I mean, from George Washington, who famously warned about not getting involved in foreign entanglements, to the isolationism that kept the U.S. out of World War I for much of the action, and out of World War II until we were directly attacked by Japan. So, in a way, the last few decades of American internationalism, the American-led post-World War II order that we've all grown up with, was a bit of an anomaly. And, yes, America made terrible mistakes along the way. I mean, Vietnam and the Iraq War are two of many that spring to mind. But it also helped build the international order that has allowed the world to experience a relatively historic period of peace and prosperity. And while many may bemoan sort of America's leadership role, what does the world look like without it? It may be one of these things of be careful what you wish for. So we can imagine if Trump wins, that a world will have a less visible U.S. footprint. The U.S. becomes a more transactional foreign policy. In terms of Europe, this means, if Trump he's long talked about how NATO countries don't pay their share in terms of defense spending. Obviously, the big question is whether or not he will pull through on his basically how much he's going to side with Russia in the Ukraine war. Does he stop funding Ukraine? What does that mean for Kyiv? What does that mean for Brussels? What does that mean for the rest of us living in Europe? Those are obviously very deep questions that no one really knows the answer to. It does feel like with an America that's more focused on itself and more navel gazing, it gives space in the world to other actors, particularly Russia and China. I think Trump is obviously much more geared up to challenge China, but less so Russia. So for Europe, that has quite a lot of implications. And then there's the whole economic policy. He's not only sort of returning to an era of the 19th century on foreign policy, but he's also returning to an era of 19th century mercantilist policy. He really sounds like a politician from the 1890s talking about a glorious time in America's past when the government was financed by tariffs on imports rather than income taxes. So, he's proposed obviously a broad 10% tariffs on all imports. That will hurt UK exports to the US. That will hurt European exports. How does the UK respond? How do Brussels respond? Do we do tit for tat tariffs? Do we go down that road? I think there's a lot of concern about how to address things. Obviously, if Harris wins, it's a much easier scenario. It's more business as usual. She may want to pressure Israel a bit more on Gaza, but you're going to see a lot of the same things that you saw under the Biden administration continue.
Right. I mean, and it is also argued that if Kamala Harris wins, well, then the kind of intimate engagement between America and this side of the Atlantic, well, that's over then. But of course, a Trump victory would bring potentially seismic implications. And curious to so many of us on this side, as you know, David, that these issues are lumped together as foreign affairs and matter so little to so many U.S. voters.
They do. It's extraordinary how little, when you look at the polls of what worries American voters, there's a big disconnect between domestic and foreign policy. I mean, the number one issue is inflation. And, when I sit in Europe and I look at the American economy, I mean, you look at the chart of GDP growth. I've actually got the Wall Street Journal in front of me, and the U.S. economy again rose at 2.8% in the third quarter, posting more strong growth. I mean, those are growth rates we would kill for in Europe. And yet the Americans are very down on the economy. They feel like the direction of the country is headed in the wrong way. The economy hasn't been good. And I think in large part, this perception has been shaped by really inflation. Just things are more expensive than they were before the pandemic. So even though the economy is growing, people feel worse off, particularly the working class, where they can sort of protect themselves less from inflation. So there's sort of, inflation, immigration, the economy. A lot of these issues dominate the conversation, dominate the thinking, dominate the way people are voting. Much further down the line is whether or not anyone's really caring that much about how Ukraine's faring on the battleground against Russia.
It is just so fascinating. David Lonow, UK Bureau Chief of the Wall Street Journal there. Thank you for coming on the program this afternoon.